This is my rifle. There are many like it, but this one is mine. It is my life. I must master it as I must master my life. Without me, my rifle is useless. Without my rifle, I am useless. I must fire my rifle true. I must shoot straighter than the enemy who is trying to kill me. I must shoot him before he shoots me. I will. My rifle and I know that what counts in war is not the rounds we fire, the noise of our burst, or the smoke we make. We know that it is the hits that count. We will hit. My rifle is human, even as I am human, because it is my life. Thus, I will learn it as a brother. I will learn its weaknesses, its strengths, its parts, its accessories, its sights, and its barrel. I will keep my rifle clean and ready, even as I am clean and ready. We will become part of each other. Before God, I swear this creed. My rifle and I are the defenders of my country. We are the masters of our enemy. We are the saviors of my life. So be it until victory is America's and there is no enemy.
November 1775. Though it had yet to utter its Declaration of Independence, America was at war with Mother Britain. The Continental Army had been created in June and the Navy in October. And now, a committee of the Continental Congress met at Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to draft a resolution calling for the creation of 2 battalions of Marines. And on November 10th, 1775, the Congress passed that resolution, drafted by John Adams, stating,
"That particular care be taken, that no persons be appointed to office or enlisted into said battalions, but such as are good seamen, or so acquainted with maritime affairs as to be able to serve to advantage by sea when required, and that they be distinguished by the names of the 1st and 2nd battalions of the American Marines."
Of course, Marines, meaning soldiers serving on ships or under naval supervision, existed long before 1775. They are as old as naval combat, going back at least as far as ancient Greece and Rome. More recently, the British had formed modern Marine units, calling them naval infantry, in the 17th century for use in its wars with the Dutch. In 1739, during hostilities with Spain, King George II called for the creation of additional Marine units. 1 regiment was drawn from American colonists, 30 companies of 100 men each drawn from most of the American colonies. Americans would serve as British Marines again almost 25 years later during the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War. But what is a Marine? A sailor? A soldier? James Fenimore Cooper, one of the earliest historians of the U.S. Navy, wrote,
"The Marines are strictly infantry soldiers who are trained to serve afloat, and their discipline, equipment, character, and esprit de corps are altogether those of an army. The Marines impart to a ship of war in a great degree its high military character. They furnish all the guards and sentinels. In battle, they repel or cover the assaults of boarders, and at all times they sustain and protect the stern and necessary discipline of a ship by their organization, distinctive character, training, and, we might add, nature." It is unusual to place one of these soldiers on board a ship of war for each gun, though the rule is not absolute. It is not, however, to be understood by this that the Marines are regularly dispersed in the ship by placing them at the guns. They act together, under their own officers, using their muskets and bayonets as their proper weapons.
Cooper went on to say,
"At no period in the naval history of the world is it probable that Marines were more important than during the War of the Revolution. In many instances, they preserved the vessels of their country by suppressing the turbulence of their ill-assorted crews. And the effect of their fire, not only then, but in all the subsequent conflicts, has usually been singularly creditable to their steadfastness and discipline.
Initially, the Marines were to be created as part of the Continental Army, but quickly it was determined that they should be independent units. On November 28th, Congress commissioned the first Marine officer, Samuel Nicholas. A local tavern owner, Nicholas was issued the first commission of captain in the new Marines, and by tradition is considered the first commandant of the Marine Corps, though the title itself did not yet exist. Captain Nicholas immediately set up recruiting officers in Tun Tavern and his own family's Conestoga Wagon Tavern. Before the end of December, he and his officers had recruited 5 companies of about 300 men each. Marine privates were paid $6 2/3 a month for their service. But, like sailors, they would receive a share of the prize money that came from any captured ship. Recruiting men turned out to be easier than arming and clothing them. The new Naval Committee in Congress did not have the money or the weapons that the Marines needed. The Pennsylvania Committee of Safety had the task of arming the Marines, but the committee also lacked sufficient arms and put out a call to the counties.
The great demand for firearms in order to equip the boats and vessels employed in defense of the River Delaware and to supply the Marines on board the Continental armed vessels, now ready to sail, has occasioned the necessity of our collecting all the arms belonging to the public in every part of the province. The associations in this city have already delivered up all that were in their hands, and we hope those in the country will cheerfully comply and deliver up all that are in their custody.
By mid-January, all of the new Marines were armed, but they would have to make do without uniforms. At this early stage in the war, the colonial textile industry could barely manage to provide uniforms for the Continental Army. The Navy and Marines would have to wait for a year. But while they might wait for uniforms, they wouldn't have to wait for action. The U.S. Marines are justifiably renowned for their amphibious assaults, and within 4 months of the resolution creating the Marines, they conducted their first offensive amphibious operation. On January 4th, 1776, as a colonial paper reported,
the first American fleet that ever swelled their sails on the Western Ocean in defense of the rights and liberties of the people of these colonies. This fleet consists of 5 sail and is commanded by Admiral Hopkins, a most experienced and venerable sea captain. The Admiral's ship is called the Columbus and mounts 36 guns. They sailed from Philadelphia amidst the acclamations of many thousands assembled on the joyful occasion, under the display of the Union flag. With 13 stripes in the field, their destination is a secret.
Those secret orders directed the fleet to harass British forces in the southern colonies. But the fleet was held up for 6 weeks when the river iced over, and in the meantime, Commodore Hopkins reconsidered. Reports indicated that the British might have gained superior firepower during the delay, but there was another target he knew of: New Providence Island in the British-held Bahamas, where a large store of precious gunpowder was held. Though most of the powder had been removed before the Marines could capture it, they did manage to seize 24 barrels, and the mission succeeded in striking British territories beyond the American colonies. Samuel Nicholas was promoted to major, and soon he and 300 Marines were incorporated into George Washington's army. During the American Revolution, Marines would fight alongside the army in the field and fight for the Navy on the water. In one of those sea battles, the Marines could claim as their own one of the political leaders of the Revolution, and the man who drafted the resolution creating the Marines, John Adams. In February 1777, John Adams was on board the frigate Boston, commanded by Commodore Samuel Tucker. Tucker was there to take Adams and his 11-year-old son, John Quincy, to France, where Adams would serve as one of the American commissioners. Adams wrote in his diary that Tucker
has very few seamen indeed. All is as yet chaos on board. His men are not disciplined. The Marines are not. The men are not exercised to the guns. They hardly know the ropes.
Adams' opinion of Captain Tucker's men must have improved, because on March 11th, he granted permission to Tucker to give chase to an enemy vessel. The ships fired upon one another, and the Marines got ready to fight. Captain Tucker later reported,
"Being very near and in such a position that the smoke blew directly over our ship, while looking around on the quarterdeck, observing the damage we had sustained from enemy fire, I observed Mr. Adams among my Marines, accoutred as one of them and in the act of defense. I then went to him and said, 'My dear sir, how come you here?' With a smile he replied, 'I ought to do my share of the fighting.' This was sufficient for me to judge of the bravery of my venerable and patriotic friend Adams."
When the war was over in 1783, both the Navy and the Marines were disbanded. Just 15 years later, however, John Adams played a role in Marine Corps history. The young country was engaged in an undeclared war with France. The Navy had been reestablished a few years earlier in 1794, and Marines were serving on ships immediately. But on July 11th, 1798, President John Adams signed into law the Act for Establishing and Organizing a Marine Corps, making them a separate branch of service. For the next century and a half, this act would serve as the only legal authority for Marine Corps missions. Two key passages dictated their primary roles. Section 3. And be it further enacted that the detachments of the Corps of Marines hereby authorized shall be made in lieu of the respective quotas of Marines, which have been established or authorized for the frigates, and other armed vessels and galleys, which shall be employed in the service of the United States. And the President of the United States may detach and appoint such of the officers of this Marine Corps to act on board the frigates, and any of the armed vessels of the United States, respectively, as he shall, from time to time, judge necessary. Section 6. And be it further enacted that the Marine Corps, established by this act, shall, at any time, be liable to do duty in the forts and garrisons of the United States, on the sea coast, or any other duty on shore, as the President, at his discretion, shall direct. So the Marine Corps would serve on land and sea alike, going wherever they were needed. But regardless of the date of this particular piece of legislation, the Marine Corps has always maintained and celebrated its birthday as November 10th, 1775, in the fires of the Revolution. Also established on July 11th, 1798, was the United States Marine Band. The band quickly gained renown within the capital, and Thomas Jefferson requested that they play at his presidential inauguration. They've played at every inauguration since, and have carried with them the nickname Jefferson gave them, the President's Own. The band's most famous conductor was John Philip Sousa, from 1880 to 1892. Sousa shaped the Marine Band into the nation's premier military band, and their concerts began drawing larger and larger audiences. Under Sousa, the Marine Band took its first tour, playing in cities across the United States. The tour was so popular that it has continued annually ever since that first in 1891. Sousa also led the Marine Band in making recordings for the phonograph, making the Marine Band among the nation's first recording stars. Prior to the Declaration of Independence, American merchant ships were protected from pirates both by the Royal Navy and by British treaties with North African states. But soon after the war, pirates from the Barbary Coast began taking American ships. For years, America had been paying tribute to pirates along the Barbary Coast. But when Jefferson became president, he refused to pay any more. In response, the Pasha of Tripoli, in present-day Libya, declared war on the United States. President Jefferson sent a small naval force to the North African coast to deal with the pirates. The American ships were initially successful, but in 1803, the frigate USS Philadelphia ran aground on an uncharted reef off of the Tripoli harbor. The ship was captured, and her officers, sailors, and Marines were enslaved, held hostage by the Pasha. Naval hero Stephen Decatur would lead a mission to sneak into the Tripoli harbor and destroy the Philadelphia, denying her to the enemy. But what about the Americans held hostage? For that, a force of just 10 Americans, mostly Marines, would cross a desert and capture a Tripolitan city, helping the Pasha of Tripoli see the wisdom of freeing the captives. William Eaton, an Army officer and former American consul to Tripoli, led the mission, relying deeply on Marine Corps Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon. The Americans were attempting a regime change, replacing the current Pasha with his brother, Hamet Karamanli. They gathered a small mercenary force and led them on a 500-mile trek across the Libyan desert toward the Tripolitan city of Derna. Along the way, they faced desertion, mutiny, starvation, and thirst. Finally, on April 27, 1805, this ragtag force struck Derna, supported by naval artillery.
At about 3:30, we had the satisfaction to see Lieutenant O'Bannon and Mr. Mann, midshipmen of the Argus, with a few brave fellows with them, enter the fort, haul down the enemy's flag, and plant the American ensign on the walls.
It was the first recorded overseas land battle for the United States since the end of the Revolutionary War, and it was a stunning success. Not long after this success, the American prisoners were released. For his courage and steadfast service, Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon was presented by Hamet Karamanli a curved Mameluke sword. In 1825, the Mameluke sword would be adopted for all Marine officers, a tradition that carries on today. And the victory at Derna would also live forever, immortalized in the Marine Corps hymn, "To the Shores of Tripoli." Traditions such as these are at the foundation of that unique Marine Corps culture that gives this fighting force its high esprit de corps. These traditions have carried on across the generations, connecting all Marines together and setting them apart from the other branches of service. These traditions include the celebration of the creation of the Marine Corps every November 10th, the use of nautical terms even when ashore, and their traditional nickname, the Leathernecks. As the official document Marine Corps Lore explains, now accepted by Webster as a synonym for Marine, the term leatherneck was derived from a leather stock once worn around the neck by both American and British Marines. Beginning in 1798, one stock of black leather and clasp was issued to each U.S. Marine annually. This stiff leather collar, fastened by two buckles at the back, measured nearly 3.5 inches high and was practical only for dress wear. It could hardly be worn in battle as it prevented the neck movement necessary for sighting along a barrel. It supposedly improved military bearing by forcing the chin high, although General George F. Elliott, recalling its use after the Civil War, said it made the wearers appear like geese looking for rain. The leather stock didn't last long past the Civil War, being dropped from the uniform in 1872. But the name Leathernecks stuck. Not long after its campaign against the Barbary pirates, the U.S. was again in conflict with Britain. Britain and France were again at war, and America was insisting that it was a neutral party. But Britain imposed trade restrictions between America and France, which was both a hardship and an insult to American sovereignty. Furthermore, Britain had captured British-born Americans from merchant sailing vessels and impressed them into service in the Royal Navy. Add to that Britain's continued support of the Indian tribes in the Northwest Territory, providing arms to Indians who then raided American settlements, and finally, in 1812, America could take no more. On June 18, 1812, Congress declared war on Great Britain. During the War of 1812, Marines continued their role as shipboard soldiers, helping to keep order on ships, suppressing mutinies, boarding enemy ships in battle, and defending against enemy boarding parties and amphibious assaults. Marines also participated in the defense of Washington, D.C. at the Battle of Bladensburg, Maryland, on August 24, 1814.
After a good deal of uncertainty concerning the movements of the enemy, it was understood he was marching directly on Washington, and that it was intended to fight at Bladensburg. The flotilla men and Marines left the yard on the morning of the 24th, and they arrived at the battleground on a trot, and were immediately drawn up about a mile to the west of Bladensburg, holding the center of General William Winder's position. After a short skirmish in front, where the enemy suffered severely in crossing a bridge, the militia fell back, and the British columns appeared, following the line of the public road.
As the militia retreated, the Marines and sailors, Cooper's flotilla men, gave cover. The entire force of the flotilla men and Marines was about 500 men, and they had 2 18s and 3 12-pounder ship's guns mounted on traveling carriages. Captain Joshua Barney took command of the artillery in person, while Captain Samuel Miller had the disposition of the remainder of the 2 parties, who were armed as infantry. The Marines, 78 men in all, formed a line immediately on the right of the guns, while the seamen, 370 men, were drawn up a little in the rear, and on the right flank of the Marines, on ground that permitted them to fire over the heads of the latter. Although the troops that were falling back did not halt, Captain Barney held his position, and as soon as the enemy began to throw rockets, he opened on them with a sharp discharge of round and grape shot. The column was staggered, and it immediately gave ground. A second attempt to advance was repulsed in the same manner, when the enemy, who, as yet, had been able to look down resistance by his discipline, advancing steadily in column, was obliged to make an oblique movement to his left, into some open fields, and to display. Here, he threw out a brigade of light troops in open order and advanced in beautiful style upon the command of Captain Barney, while the head of a strong column was kept in reserve in a copse in its rear. Captain Miller, with the Marines, and that portion of the seamen who acted as infantry, met the charge in the most steady and gallant manner, and after a short conflict, drove the British light troops back upon their supporting column. There can be no question that a couple of regular regiments would now have given the Americans the day, but no troops remained in line, except the party under Captain Barney and 2 detachments on his right that were well posted. Having been so roughly handled, the enemy made no attempt to advance directly in front of the seamen and Marines, but, after forcing the troops on their right from the field by a demonstration in that direction, they prepared to turn the rear of Captain Barney in order to surround him. While these movements were going on in front, a party of light troops had been thrown out on the enemy's right, and the militia, having abandoned the ground, were also beginning to close upon the Americans that stood. By this time, Captain Barney, Captain Miller, and several other officers were wounded, and victory being impossible against odds so great, an order was given to commence a retreat. Of the Marines, nearly 1/3 were among the casualties. No troops could have stood better, and the fire of both artillery and musketry had been described as to the last degree severe. Captain Barney himself and Captain Miller of the Marine Corps in particular gained much additional reputation, and their conspicuous gallantry caused a deep and general regret that their efforts could not have been sustained by the rest of the army. Given the size of the British force, it was a battle that perhaps could never have been won. The British pushed through to Washington and put it to the torch. But though the British burned the White House and Capitol and most of the other public buildings, they failed to burn the Marine Commandant's house, the official residence of all but the first 2 commandants of the Marines. Legend has it that they refrained from burning the Commandant's house in recognition of the courage shown by Marines at Bladensburg. In the last great battle of the war, in fact, a battle taking place after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, but before word reached the armies, a small detachment of Marines helped General Andrew Jackson beat back an invading British force. That battle, on January 8, 1815, was the greatest U.S. victory on land during the war. But it might not have been possible without a battle fought a few weeks earlier, 9 miles south of New Orleans, on the banks of the Mississippi River. An advanced British force had landed and made camp, awaiting reinforcements before attacking the city. At that time, the city was virtually undefended and could not have held out against the invaders. General Jackson led a small force in a surprise attack in the night. Major A. Lacarrière Latour, who served under Jackson, estimated that the British had almost 5,000 men, while Jackson led 2,100. The Americans struck with a 3-pronged attack, and Major Latour reported that the Marines fought in the battalion commanded by Jackson himself.
The right, commanded by General Jackson in person, was composed of a detachment of Marines under the command of Lieutenant Bellevue, 66 men strong, a detachment of artillery, the 7th Regiment, and the 44th Regiment. I saw General Jackson in advance of all who were near him, at a time when the enemy was making a charge on the artillery within pistol shot and in the midst of a shower of bullets. And in that situation, I observed him spiriting and urging on the Marines. And the right of the 7th Regiment, who, animated by the presence of their gallant commander-in-chief, attacked the enemy so briskly that they soon forced him to retire.
Latour explained the significance of the victory.
The result of the affair of the 23rd was the saving of Louisiana. For it cannot be doubted but that the enemy, had he not been attacked with such impetuosity when he had hardly effected his disembarkation, would, that very night or early next morning, have marched against the city, which was not then covered by any fortification, and was defended by hardly 5,000 men, mostly militia, who could not in the open field have withstood disciplined troops, accustomed to the use of the bayonet, a weapon with which most of the militia were unprovided.
Jackson used the reprieve to shore up the defenses, building artillery batteries and stripping the heavy guns from a grounded warship to provide needed firepower. And when the British attacked on New Year's Day, 1815, they were repulsed. They were knocked back again on January 8th by Jackson's amalgamated force of Army, Marines, militia, pirates, and freed slaves. The British limped away with over 2,000 casualties to the Americas 71. Soon after the battle on the 8th, word reached the armies of the Treaty of Ghent. The war was over. In the first few years after the war, the Marines fell into disarray as the top position, commandant, turned over multiple times. But things turned around quickly in 1820, when the grand old man of the Marine Corps took charge. All of 37 years old when he was made commandant, Archibald Henderson would hold the position for 38 years, the longest term for any commandant of the Marines. Though he was, and remains, the youngest man to ever be named to the position, Henderson would become legendary as the grand old man of the Marine Corps. He would serve 11 presidents as commandant before his death in 1859. During his first years, decades in fact, as commandant, the nation was not at war with foreign powers. But this did not mean peace and quiet for the Marines. They battled pirates multiple times in the 1820s and 30s, including a major strike against Malay pirates in 1832. The pirates had recently captured an American merchant ship off the coast of the Sumatran town of Kuala Batu, murdering most of the crew. Now, in February 1832, the U.S. frigate Potomac, under the command of Commodore John Downes, disguised itself as a merchant vessel and anchored itself 5 miles off the coast of the town. The pirates, numbering about 4,000, controlled well-armed forts overlooking the harbor. Navy Lieutenant Irvine Shubrick commanded the expedition, and Lieutenants Alvin Edson and George Terrett commanded the Marine detachment. Lieutenant Shubrick wrote,
I feel much indebted to Lieutenants Edson and Taylor for the promptness displayed by them in forming the Marines and in assisting in forming the other divisions, all of which was effected with coolness in 15 minutes. As soon as the day dawned, we proceeded along the beach towards the town, undiscovered by the enemy until within a short distance of the northernmost fort.
The 4 divisions of Marines and sailors were each assigned a fort. The Marines under Edson and Terrett moved to their assignment, Tuco de Lima, in the jungle behind the town of Kuala Batu. The outnumbered Marines charged into fire from musket, cannon, and blunderbuss. But what they lacked in number, they made up for in discipline, breaking through the outer walls and capturing the fort. The American colors were raised, and, leaving a detachment with Terrett, Edson moved on to assist the other divisions with the capture and destruction of the final fort. Commodore Downes later wrote of speaking to a representative of the town.
I assured him that if forbearance should not be exercised hereafter from committing piracies and murders upon American citizens, other ships of war would be dispatched to inflict upon them further punishment. Several Rajas from towns in the vicinity have visited my ship. All of them have declared their friendly disposition toward Americans.
But despite naval actions like these, there had been a movement towards merging the Marine Corps into the Army. President Andrew Jackson himself had made such a recommendation in 1829. The grand old man disagreed, having written years earlier,
The Marine Corps is, and must continue to be, an appendage of the Navy.
By 1798, orders establishing the Marine Corps implicitly made the Marines part of the Department of the Navy, and in 1834, the Act of the Better Organization of the United States Marine Corps made that relation explicit. The Navy and the Marines remain distinct organizations, but both are under the Department of the Navy. But it wasn't long after that political success that Henderson led the Marines into an entirely land-based conflict. In 1836, during wars with the Creek and Seminole Indians, Commandant Henderson volunteered the services of the Marine Corps to support the Army. Henderson put himself in charge of the Regiment of Marines. Legend has it that Henderson left a note pinned to his office door should anyone come looking for him.
Have gone to Florida to fight Indians. We'll be back when the war is over. A. Henderson, Colonel, Commandant.
For his actions during the war, Henderson would be breveted Brigadier General, making him the first general officer in Marine Corps history. The Marines were proving themselves to be an excellent force for quick deployment against hostile forces. In 1846, that meant war with Mexico and the roots of the line from the Marine Corps hymn, "From the halls of Montezuma." 200 Marines were assigned to the Division of the Army under Major General John Quitman. General Quitman wrote, 2 weeks after the capture of Mexico City,
At dawn on the morning of the 13th, the batteries again opened an active and effective fire upon the castle, which was returned by the enemy with spirit and some execution. During this cannonade, active preparations were made for the assault on the castle. Ladders, pickaxes, and crows were placed in the hands of a pioneer storming party of select men from the Volunteer Division, under command of Captain Reynolds of the Marine Corps, to accompany the storming party of 120 men, which had been selected from all the corps of the same division, and placed under the command of Major Twiggs of the Marines. The storming parties, led by the gallant officers who had volunteered for this desperate service, rushed forward like a resistless tide. The Mexicans, behind their batteries and breastworks, stood with more than usual firmness. For a short time, the contest was hand-to-hand. Swords and bayonets were crossed and rifles clubbed. Resistance, however, was vain against the desperate valor of our brave troops. The batteries and strong works were carried, and the ascent of Chapultepec on that side laid open to an easy conquest. In these works were taken 7 pieces of artillery, 1,000 muskets, and 550 prisoners, of whom 100 were officers, among them 1 general and 10 colonels. The command of the storming party from the Volunteer Division devolved on Captain James Miller of the 2nd Pennsylvania Regiment by the death of its chief, the brave and lamented Twiggs of the Marine Corps, who fell on the first advance at the head of his command.
In 1875, History of the United States Marine Corps described the Marines' assignment to sweep clean the halls of Montezuma following the capture of the city.
The Marines accompanied their division in all its progress and participated in the long and bloody battle by which finally the avenue to the city was opened. The palace was overrun with escaped convicts and other desperate characters bent on plunder. Lieutenant Colonel Watson, with his battalion of Marines, was ordered to clear it of these intruders and protect it from spoliation, which duty he promptly and successfully performed.
Another tradition, rooted in this Mexican-American War, is the supposed origin for the red stripes on the trousers of Marine officers and NCOs. Legend has it that the stripe represents the blood shed by Marines battling before Chapultepec and commemorates the bravery and tenacity of those men. The war with Mexico was won, but it would only aggravate the political situation in the United States, where the struggle between slave states and free soilers was already turning bloody. In 1859, Commandant General Archibald Henderson would die in office, having spent a lifetime developing a better trained and more disciplined, courageous, and effective Marine Corps. The Marines would feel his loss, but he himself was spared from seeing what was to come as the nation tore itself apart in civil war. Actually, the Marines' involvement started before the war, at the event that many said made the Civil War inevitable. On October 16, 1859, John Brown led a small force of armed men in the capture of the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. The new commandant of the Marines, Colonel John Harris, ordered a force of Marines into action under First Lieutenant Israel Green. Overall command of the mission fell to Army Colonel Robert E. Lee. When Brown's force refused to surrender peacefully, Greene led his Marines into action. Greene later reported,
The men made a tremendous assault upon the door. The second blow broke it in. This entrance was a ragged hole low down in the right-hand door, the door being splintered and cracked some distance upward. I instantly stepped from my position in front of the stone abutment and entered the opening.
Greene found John Brown reloading his carbine, having just fired a shot that missed Greene.
I brought my saber down with all my strength upon his head. He was moving as the blow fell, and I suppose I did not strike him where I intended, for he received a deep saber cut in the back of the neck. He fell senseless on his side, then rolled over on his back. He had in his hand a short, sharp cavalry carbine. I think he had just fired, for the Marine who followed me into the aperture made by the ladder received a bullet in the abdomen, from which he died in a few minutes. Instinctively, as Brown fell, I gave him a saber thrust in the left breast. The sword I carried was a light uniform weapon, and, either not having a point or striking something hard in Brown's accoutrements, did not penetrate. The blade bent double. By that time, 3 or 4 of my men were inside. They came rushing in like tigers, as a storming assault is not a play-day sport. They bayoneted one man skulking under the engine and pinned another fellow up against the rear wall, both being instantly killed. I ordered the men to spill no more blood. The other insurgents were at once taken under arrest, and the contest ended.
So the first Marine was killed before the Civil War had even begun. But he would not be the last. 44 Marines would be killed at the first Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, 1861. Only 353 Marines were with the 35,000-man Union force in that battle, which became an ignominious defeat. Most of the Marines that day, like most of the Union forces in general, were inexperienced and raw. When the battle turned so badly and the Union forces fled the field, the Marines ran with them. Commandant Colonel Harris reported the action to the Secretary of the Navy, saying it was the first instance in Marine Corps history where any portion of its members turned their backs to the enemy. Throughout most of the war, Marines were primarily used in their traditional role as naval and amphibious combat troops. One such action occurred in May 1862. 5 Union ships drove up the James River, straight at the Confederate capital of Richmond. They encountered fierce resistance from Fort Darling on Drury's Bluff, about 7 miles south of Richmond. For his actions that day, Marine Corporal John Mackey became the first Marine to receive the Medal of Honor. But despite that honor and the actions of Marines like him, the Marines remain a very small part of the U.S. military. During the war, its maximum strength remained below 4,200 men and had only 148 combat casualties. Clearly, the nation's political and military leaders had not yet settled on an effective use of this effective fighting force. But with the war over, the Marines were again deployed for foreign missions. Major and minor actions in Korea, Japan, Uruguay, Mexico, Colombia, the Hawaiian Islands, Argentina, Haiti, Nicaragua, Chile, North China, Panama, and more would occupy the Marines over the next several decades. In many of these cases, the combination of naval warships and the possibility of an amphibious landing were enough to maintain peace without a fight. In others, such as Korea in 1871 and Panama in 1885, the fighting exploded. In these actions, the sterling performance of the Marines did much to strengthen their reputation. In Korea, Marine Captain McLean Tilton led his men in amphibious assaults, as well as across rugged terrain in the capture of enemy forts. Captain W.S. Schley of the U.S. Navy wrote a description of the Marine Navy assault on the final fort known as the Citadel, which appeared in Harper's Weekly in 1894.
Within the citadel, the Korean forces were drawn up in columns of 7 or 8 deep from the south to the north, facing the point of the assault, with a double line of riflemen on the parapet behind them. The front rank was held by spearmen resting on their knees, with long lances poised to defend the column of infantry back of them, who opened a terrific fire upon those who first appeared on the parapet opposite. Captain Tilton and Lieutenant Breese with the Marines rushed in over the south wall, and Master McLean over the north, and then the fighting in the citadel was at close quarters. For 25 minutes the combat was hand-to-hand and most desperate, but the onslaught of bayonets with breech-loading muskets fired the moment the bayonets had pierced the front rank men, carrying down whole files behind, was more than human flesh and blood could be expected to stand. The enemy's lines first wavered and then gave way, and in great confusion and consternation they sought to retreat over the crest of the hill towards the road up the river.
The Marines continued to fight in conflicts large and small, wherever the nation sent them, always faithful. That attitude of fidelity around 1883 became the official motto of the U.S. Marine Corps. Semper Fidelis, the Latin words meaning always faithful. Usually shortened to Semper Fi, the motto voices the loyalty of Marines to each other, to their mission, to the Corps, and to their country. And the Marines would continue to demonstrate that loyalty in multiple conflicts as the 19th century came to an end and the 20th century took off. In the Spanish-American War, Marines fought in the 5-day Battle of Guantanamo Bay. At one point during the battle, the Marines had requested that the USS Dolphin provide fire support by pouring artillery fire onto Spanish positions. But the Dolphin misinterpreted a signal regarding the location of the Spanish, and instead, their heavy guns fired into the Marines. Sergeant John Quick put himself in the crossfire in an attempt to send a new signal to the Dolphin. Stephen Crane, the novelist most famous for the Red Badge of Courage, was a war correspondent with the Marines and described what happened.
Sergeant Quick arose and announced that he was a signalman. He produced from somewhere a blue polka dot neckerchief as large as a quilt. He tied it on a long, crooked stick. Then he went to the top of the ridge and, turning his back to the Spanish fire, began to signal to the Dolphin. Again, we gave a man sole possession of a particular part of the ridge. We didn't want it, but he could have it, and welcome. If the young sergeant had had the smallpox, the cholera, and the yellow fever, we could not have slid out with more celerity. As men have said often, it seems as if there was in this war a god of battles who held his mighty hand before the Americans. As I looked at Sergeant Quick, wig-wagging there against the sky, I would not have given a tin tobacco tag for his life. Escape for him seemed impossible. It seemed absurd to hope that he would not be hit. I only hoped that he would be hit just a little in the arm, the shoulder, or the leg. I watched his face, and it was as grave and serene as that of a man writing in his own library. He was the very embodiment of tranquility and occupation. He stood there amid the animal-like babble of the Cubans, the crack of rifles, and the whistling snarl of the bullets. To say the least, a fight at close range is absorbing as a spectacle. No man wants to take his eyes from it until that time comes when he makes up his mind to run away. To deliberately stand up and turn your back to a battle is in itself hard work. To deliberately stand up and turn your back to a battle and hear immediate evidences of the boundless enthusiasm with which a large company of the enemy shoot at you from an adjacent thicket is, to my mind at least, a very great feat. One need not dwell upon the detail of keeping the mind carefully upon a slow spelling of an important code message. I saw Quick betray only one sign of emotion as he swung his clumsy flag to and fro, an end of it once caught on a cactus pillar, and he looked sharply over his shoulder to see what had it. He gave the flag an impatient jerk. He looked annoyed.
Semper Fi, indeed. Sergeant John Quick would later be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. The Spanish-American War led to the Philippine-American War, and then the Boxer Rebellion in China. The Marines' successful handling of these two conflicts in the Pacific helped establish the capabilities of the fighting force and the nation. The Boxer Rebellion was an anti-foreigner uprising in China in 1900. Nationalists resented the Opium Wars, Christian missionaries, and other foreign influences in China. In June 1900, the Boxers began attacking foreign embassies. But Marines from the U.S. and other countries had been sent to reinforce the embassy guards. One of the U.S. Marines was Private Daniel Daly. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in single-handedly defending a wall against repeated attacks. Private Daly would later become one of only 2 Marines to be awarded the Medal of Honor twice for 2 separate actions. He received his second Medal of Honor for actions against Haitian rebels in 1915, now as a gunnery sergeant. His citation for that action reads,
Gunnery Sergeant Daly was one of the company to leave Fort Liberty, Haiti, for a 6-day reconnaissance. After dark, on the evening of the 24th of October, while crossing the river in a deep ravine, the detachment was suddenly fired upon from 3 sides by about 400 cacaos, concealed in bushes about 100 yards from the fort. The Marine detachment fought its way forward to a good position, which it maintained during the night, although subjected to continuous fire from the cacaos. At daybreak, the Marines, in 3 squads, advanced in 3 different directions, surprising and scattering the cacaos in all directions. Gunnery Sergeant Daly fought with exceptional gallantry against heavy odds throughout this action.
But despite these awards for valor, Daly may be best remembered for words he shouted to his men during the Battle of Belleau Wood in World War I.
Come on, you sons of bitches! Do you want to live forever?
Following the Boxer Rebellion, Marine deployments were included in Panama, the Cuban classifications, Morocco, Veracruz, Santo Domingo, and the so-called Banana Wars in Haiti and Nicaragua. In these conflicts, and over the course of decades, the role of the Marines shifted somewhat. Although still tightly connected to the Navy, the Marines were proving themselves more and more as an always ready expeditionary force. The Navy, of course, makes the Marines' rapid deployment and amphibious assaults possible, but with the growth of the Steel Navy and the far more professional modern U.S. Navy sailors, the traditional Marine duties of guarding against boarding from another ship and maintaining discipline among the crew became less and less relevant. The Marines were becoming the nation's stopgap military force, the first fighters ready for immediate deployment, to take control of an area and hold it until the larger Army forces can be organized and deployed. The lessons learned in actions to this point would pay off soon, as America was drawn into the storm of World War I.